What I've got as handouts here are the sort of the core documents for urban growth boundaries. One of them is the goal 14 itself. One of them is administrative rules, primarily for goal 14. And the third one is state laws that pertain to it. And it may not have all the state laws that pertain to it because they're little pieces of things scattered around, but most of the core statutes are there. So, what I want to do is just kind of assume that you don't have any knowledge of UGBs, and we'll just start at the beginning. Hi. Come on in. Just passing some handouts here that are just background. We're not going to spend any time on these handouts, but they're probably something you'll want to just keep at your desk and constantly review over the years. So LCDC adopted Goal 14 out of the 19 statewide land use goals. They adopted a lot of them in 1974, including this one. This is the urbanization goal. The urbanization goal, we spent a long time at LCDC trying to argue about and determine what some things meant. And one of them is that it says a long-term supply. And the long-term supply sort of evolved over a number of years into where it was finally firmly established that it was a 20-year supply. And ultimately, the term 20-year was made its way into some statutes, and then at some point when LCDC amended Goal 14 in 2004, we formally put it in the goal itself. But up until then, it was a long point of contention. And the point being that an urban growth boundary is generally intended to provide, I like to say, encircle or enclose a 20-year supply of developable land. And the notion on that is, first of all, a big core element of Oregon's land use planning program is that everybody has a long-term, long-range comprehensive plan. And so the 20-year comprehensive plan is what we're talking about, and the main feature of that 20-year plan for cities is enclosing a land supply. So all UGBs were actually not acknowledged until by 1985, even though the original statutes and goals for the land use program thought that would take place in a couple of years. It didn't turn out that way, and really the first acknowledgments started to happen around 79. And then we had an intense period of 4 or 5 years of acknowledgments. And by 1985, everybody had been acknowledged. And what that means essentially is for many cities, their 20-year land supply was set up then, and interestingly today, many of those UGBs haven't been amended. All the UGBs were acknowledged initially under what we call the old Goal 14. That's not what I've handed to you because LCDC changed the goal in 2006. Not really substantially, but on a few key points. Moreover, in 1995, a very significant change to state law was made. And that change was to put into statute a set of what we call the priorities. The priorities statutes in ORS 197-298 provide that when an urban growth boundary is amended, and by the way, everything we're talking about here is about amending UGBs because they were all done by that initial, all cities had a UGB, and except for La Pine recently, we really don't have anybody establishing them. But when a UGB is amended under 298, there's a set of priorities that are required by law, and we're going to talk about them in more detail in a later slide. That was a very significant change to the process, because up until then, instead of the priorities, what you had is a set of factors. So what I want to do is, before we go too much into this, and it's not on the slide, but if you look at the goal that I handed to you, you'll see that there's sort of several main key features. The opening feature is a requirement that everybody have an urban growth boundary. The second feature in the goal is land need. The third one is location. And you'll see that under location, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 features here that are called out. There used to be 7 factors, but when we changed the goal, we recognized that some of those, at least for sure one of them, was embodied in the state law. And so what you'll see in this boundary location part at the bottom of the first page is that an urban growth boundary has to be consistent with 197-298. So that we've inserted right into the goal, with the understanding that that statute is such a significant part of UGB law now that the goal by itself doesn't really encompass it. The other point I've noted on this slide here is that in 2006, LCDC finally managed to adopt a detailed set of administrative rules, and I handed those out to you as well. That's Division 24, that provide the UGB process detail that you don't see in the goal. And we're not going to go through these today at all, but just remember that they're there, so that if you have detailed questions about this process, as we go, especially as we go through this work group, there's a lot of detail in these rules. It's a higher level of detail than we're going to get to today. The other interesting thing to remember about these rules is they also have, again for the first time in '06, rules about forecasting population. And then the other thing to remember is that there's a whole lot of UGB requirements that are embodied in case law. Urban growth boundary, I remember there was a series of years beginning about the late 80s and early 90s when what we would tell people is about half the cases being litigated on land use programs were over UGB amendments. I don't know if that statistic was true, and we've stopped saying it anymore, so maybe it isn't true anymore, but there is a lot of litigation on UGBs. And really significant cases, for example, the Metro UGB is litigated almost every time, and it's in litigation now. And so over a period of years, the courts have interpreted the law and the goal as well. And when LCDC amended the goal in 2004, and when we did these rules, we tried to collect a lot of that case law into the revised goal and the new rules, because otherwise you don't really see that. The lay person can't go look up cases and see some of this minutia. So we did our best. As I say, that was 2006, and things have continued to evolve in case law. And we'll be talking, I think, in this work group quite a bit about the McMinnville case, for example, which is all subsequent to these rules. So,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
So on the way here, I was listening to OPB, and they said that they were talking about Damascus. So does Damascus have a UGB? Because
Damascus was incorporated in an area that's already in the Metro UGB. So the Metro UGB, and this is on the next slide. No, I didn't put it in here. So there's a couple of UGBs today, and there used to be even more, that involve more than one city. The Metro UGB has 26 cities and 3 counties. It used to say 25, but Damascus was incorporated, and that's land already in the UGB that Metro had taken in their UGB, big UGB amendment they did years ago. And so uniquely, Damascus doesn't have to adopt anything under Goal 14 as they prepare their comprehensive plan. It's all about what is the zoning and planning for the area that's there. Thankfully, I think they don't have to go through this.
so it's just separate comprehensive plans, even though they're within the metro.
Right, all of those 20, each of those 26 cities has their own separate comprehensive plan. They don't worry about the urban growth boundary, except for there are a lot of metro requirements that sort of spin off from Metro's establishment of that boundary. When Metro established and changes their boundary, they make assumptions about what land in various parts of the boundary will be planned and zoned for. And that's actually carried out by the individual cities that are in that particular part of the boundary. So that's what's going on with Damascus. So everything we're dealing with is otherwise about amendments to UGBs because everything is acknowledged. So mostly what you'll hear us talk about is the UGB amendment process. When a UGB is amended for any city, it's officially a plan amendment, and all the statewide goals and rules applied, including Goal 14. And so a lot of what's in Goal 14 that's live and important are the criteria for amending UGBs. And those criteria are also embodied in our rules, and as I mentioned a minute ago, in the statutes, especially at 298. The idea was that UGBs would be a rolling 20-year supply. It's certainly the case that as soon as a city adopts a 20-year UGB, the next year they don't have a 20-year supply if people have been developing in their town, if they're growing. So of course it's going to be less than 20 years as it goes on, and then eventually a city would replenish that supply. Well, it hasn't exactly worked out that way. The main vehicle for trying to make sure UGBs were replenished and reevaluated was periodic review. When it was first established, pretty much everybody had to go through periodic review, or those cities less than 2,500 had a real quick expedited process. But as the years went on, and especially starting, there was one kind of change to the process in the early to mid-90s, 1999 a bigger change, and in 2003 an even larger change. The effect is that today only large cities, over 10,000, have to complete periodic review on a schedule that means that some of them aren't even going to get to it for a while, or some of them have completed it and are off the track for quite a while. But everybody else, including all counties and smaller cities, no longer have to do periodic review. We'll talk more about that in our work group, because part of 2224 was asking that this work group come up, that LCDC rules come up with a replacement process to periodic review. Periodic review is no longer but live for most cities. For those cities where it does apply, they have to reevaluate their UGB land supply and bring it up to a 20-year supply. And most of what's left of periodic review today is about UGB and replenishing that land supply and related planning. There are many UGBs that haven't been amended since the beginning. Mostly we're talking about towns that haven't grown, or towns that haven't grown very fast. And people that were around in the early 80s will freely say that LCDC acknowledged a lot of UGBs with a 20-year land supply where reasonably it was more. In fact, I think there were some very generous UGBs. It was quite a lot of contention in the acknowledgement years over UGBs. Cities did try to get, in general, as large of a UGB as they could get through the process. So either because they were really large, or again because they haven't been growing, there are a number of UGBs that haven't been amended. But part of what that means is there's more and more pressure, because as more and more time passes since these plans that were generally from 1980, those plans are now 13, 15 years out of date. More and more cities are reaching the point where they do want to amend their UGB. And so that's part of why we're in this exercise, because the pressure is going to continue to build. So another feature of Goal 14 in UGBs. UGBs provide land for urban development. And so this whole terminology about urban will come up here. Because of the way Goal 14 is written, and I handed these out. John, there were some handouts that you probably already have. You'll note it right at the very beginning that that UGBs, it's in this intro paragraph, that a UGB divides urban land from rural land. And there was a significant 1985 Supreme Court case where the whole question of what is urban and rural was litigated in the context of Curry County. And the Supreme Court issued a very long, large opinion saying essentially, well, the intent of the goal was that these terms really meant something, and that an urban scale use is different than a rural use, even though there were at that time no definitions of either term in the goals. Went through a lot of work throughout the 1990s, trying to define land. When is a use that is outside of the UGB inappropriately urban? Because if it's an urban use, it's supposed to be inside a UGB. And if it's an urban use on rural land, there needs to be an exception to Goal 14. Well, I think it should be noted that there's an awful lot of land outside UGBs that is clearly urban. All of the unincorporated communities in the state, and certainly a large number of almost 1 million acres of what we call rural residential exceptions. There's some portion of those where the development pattern is pretty urban. In late 1990s, LCDC went through a very long process of trying to decide what level of rural land outside of UGB was, quote, urban, and those rules are in Division 4. I didn't hand them out to you. They mostly apply to exceptions land. And that thankfully is behind us, and they also went through a series of exercises identifying rural communities and trying to describe what uses in there, allowing you, we amended the goal at the time to say, oh, you can have urban uses in communities. So that was a small goal amendment that happened even earlier than the one I'm talking about here in '06. So just a feature to keep in mind. Now, UGBs include urban land that's already urbanized. Almost every UGB has that. I think they all do. But then some amount of land that isn't urbanized, and that the goal calls urbanizable. Urbanizable is not, unfortunately, a really clean, bright line. Some cities have tried to draw that line. Generally, it's the land that's in the UGB, but is not developed, and typically unserved. So if we were to think or envision a typical UGB, it would have at its core the already developed land, and then as you get out from that core, you'd see areas that are just vacant fields. They're enclosed by the UGB. They may not have sewer or water, or maybe some of them do, but they are intended for the 20-year supply, and that's called urbanizable land. And it'll come up from time to time as we're talking about UGBs. Yes?
So is farmland considered vacant land?
Yes, but it's not in a UGB. And so the point about UGBs is that 20-year land supply of urban and urbanizable land is separated from rural land by the UGB. Outside of the UGB is whatever it is, 17 million acres of new land, all the forest land in the state, as I said, rural unincorporated communities, and about 1 million acres of exception lands. All of those are lands outside the UGB, or we'll sometimes use the term in land use circles. That's rural land. If it's in a UGB, even if it's a farmer's field, but it's by virtue of being in the UGB, that is urbanizable land. And so that land is designated for long-term development. Now, another kind of piece of all of this that's not really written down. Years ago, we used to talk about this as some sort of pact or deal that was made in the early days with home builders over Goal 10. And that was just the understanding that, yeah, we have a lot of restrictions for development on land outside UGBs. But the understanding is that inside of UGBs, it should be easier, much easier to develop. The path to development should be streamlined. The expectation is that land in the UGB is developable. You don't have to show need, which had been a big feature in the late 70s of planning nationwide. You have to show a need. But need has been shown. That's needed for 20 years growth. It's in the UGB. It should be developable. And indeed, many cities treat it that way, although from time to time you'll get into arguments about whether a particular city is making it too hard. So UGBs are amended. As I said before, we're mostly talking about amending a UGB rather than establishing one. The amendment could be initiated by a city. We tend to call that a legislative amendment, or an applicant. And sometimes an applicant will come to a city and say, I want to put these 20 acres in a UGB of land that I own. And we've had probably a running argument for years as to whether that's quasi-judicial or not. Quasi-judicial being a land use consideration by a city, in this case, that's really more confined to a particular property rather than citywide. And the argument against that is that, well, every time you amend a UGB, you have to look at the entire UGB. So can you really ever be quasi-judicial? And I don't know that we've ever reached a clear conclusion on that, but just bear in mind that you kind of have both flavors of UGB amendments. Obviously, it's an open formal process with notice and public testimony. And a county and a city mutually adopt a UGB. So when a UGB was established and when a UGB is amended, it has to be, that final land use action to adopt that boundary amendment also has to be concurred in by the county. This is the coordination function. It's usually, but not always, it's usually sort of pro forma. A lot of counties prefer that the city do all the work to amend the boundary, make all the findings, meet all the standards, and do it, and then the county will act in their own set of hearings and with their own land use order afterwards. Probably most places that's how it's done, but certainly there are some counties that take a very active interest in the UGB and are at the table throughout it all and have their own set of issues and concerns. You're going to hear the word PAPA thrown around quite a bit in this work group, the Post-Acknowledgement Plan Amendment. By the way, it's an obsolete term because the statute was changed a couple years ago, and in the rewrite of the PAPA statutes, they ended up not using the word Post-Acknowledgement Plan Amendment. So when people are referring to a PAPA, you can't even find that term in the statute anymore. But
It persists.
It persists. And then there's a whole series of categories of UGB amendments that LCDC approves, and I didn't put all these in the slide, but you can find them pretty quickly on the statutes. You know precisely where that is?
No, I don't. Generally over 50 acres, but with a few minor things here and there.
Yeah, essentially it's if the amendment includes more than 50 acres. So if you're amending the boundary by more than 50 acres, and if you're over a certain size of a city, then that amendment has to come to LCDC for final approval. So periodically, and I think we're talking about in January, for example, LCDC will have on their docket a UGB amendment that a city has approved. LCDC has to concur with that amendment, although the way it really works procedurally as that amendment comes into the department, the director and the staff will review that amendment against the goals and the statutes. The director can issue a report approving the UGB or denying it. And then there's an opportunity to appeal that to the commission. I don't know whether there's ever been a situation where that didn't end up going from the director to the commission, but just went back to the jurisdiction or went on. But
Yeah, that has happened.
it has happened.
Yeah.
So theoretically, this is something that could be done just by the department. But all the rest of the UGB amendments that are approved locally, if there is an appeal, and as I mentioned earlier, appeals are pretty frequent with regard to UGB amendments, then that will go to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and they will review it. Once LCDC approves it, or once LUBA has approved one, there's always the opportunity to go up to the Court of Appeals, and a lot of this UGB case law that we talked about earlier is set by the Court of Appeals in those kinds of appeals. So I'm going to go through quickly the steps of a UGB amendment. It starts with a 20-year population forecast, and the city and county convert that forecast into a 20-year need for housing, for commercial, industrial, public facilities, schools, parks, lots of things. What is the amount of land available in the city for 20 years? So once the city goes through a calculation, and by the way, it looks like these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but most cities do this in an iterative fashion. It's not really step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they'll jump back and forth as they do it. It's all done at once in the end. They'll convert that need, that 20-year population or employment forecast into needs, and then they'll do an inventory and decide how much of that need can be accommodated in the current urban growth boundary. And part of what that step involves, I've got them. I'll just quickly go through. And if they can't accommodate all that land in the UGB, they would add lands to the UGB, and they would designate that land added for the uses. So I've set these out in each of these in a slide. Housing needs when they're forecast for 20 years. That's a forecast for types of housing, density ranges, and a lot of things that have to do with needed housing. In this work group, we're going to have a point where we stop as an exercise and get into this in a lot of detail. But as I mentioned, you've got to consider need for a lot of other things as well. And for employment uses, sometimes there's an employment forecast, sometimes not. But in the end, the city has to convert those forecasts into things that look like land or capacity. And it's not all, those are kind of interwoven, and we'll get into that in this second step. So as the city looks at how much land in the UGB can accommodate the 20-year need that they've calculated, they're going to inventory their land that's already in the UGB. They're going to look for the potential for vacant land to be redeveloped or infilled. That's an important step, and it's one that's caused some of the concern about the process as being a step that can be appealed and is. And then they're going to compare their need to the total capacity and make a determination of whether if they can accommodate that entire need, perhaps by making things more efficient in the current UGB, by upzoning land, allow higher densities than it's currently zoned, change some industrial to high-density housing. All kinds of things could be done that we kind of call efficiency measures to accommodate that need. They have to go through those steps, and after that, if there's still not enough capacity, then the city may add land to the UGB. So in order to do that, it is typically done with a study of adjacent land to determine, well, one of the things they're looking at as they study that is what can they serve for that surrounding area. Now, we use the term adjacent in our rules. We clarify that it's not, it doesn't mean abutting, but it's some amount of land in the vicinity of the UGB. And that's a topic we're going to get into with this work group, because the new statute has an even more refined practice on how to do that. You're looking for land that can actually has the characteristics identified as needed. So some cities will say, well, we just want to add industrial land and we want large flat sites. That will mean that this sort of scan of land for a possible UGB amendment is going to look at the large flat sites. If there's really hilly slope sites, they're not going to look at those, and they necessarily don't have to. Step 4 then is they add lands from the study area in order to provide for that deficit of need that they identified in the previous step. These are the statutes these are the 298 statutes that I mentioned earlier. Here's the priorities. First, urban reserved, if there are any, and there are a few cities that have established urban reserves, and of course Metro most recently. But if those are there, those are the first thing. And by the way, when we talk about this revised statute for 2254, the second one here, exceptions and non-resource lands. These are areas that are not farmland. There are exceptions to farmland, or they were never farmland or forest land because they're non-resource. They're the next highest priority. But the new law combines those two, so that if we were to look at this same list for 2254, urban reserves, exceptions, and non-resource land would all be in one category. Then finally, if there's not enough of that land to add to the UGB, then the lowest value resource land must be the next priority. The city and county have to add land in from having made a determination of what its resource value is. Is it class 1, 2, 3, 4 farmland? With the class 6 being the highest priority they add in. If they don't have any class 5, class 4, class 3, and going on down. And then only if they still don't have enough land in that study area to add to the UGB, do they go to the higher value resource lands. Now there are some exceptions that I'm not even going to go into unless you want to, where you can jump these categories because you have to go through some good farmland in order to run your sewer line to get to the poor farmland. It's the next category, where it's all surrounded by the land you're going to add, so you might as well add the good land as well. Things like that, but generally not. Then we get to the amendments that we made in 04 and 06, which were all about trying to blend these statutory priorities with the factors that were already in Goal 14 and that LCDC revised slightly and they amended the goal in 2004 or 5. And this is based on case law, so that only after, for example, if your city needs 100 acres and they get down to lower value resource lands, and they have more lower value resource lands around their UGB than 100 acres, how do they choose among that category? At that point, they would go to these Goal 14 factors, and I'll just refer you to the second page right at the top. You'll see that these factors are listed: efficient combination, orderly and economic provision, comparative analysis of energy, economic, environmental, and social consequences, and compatibility with nearby ag and forest lands. These are factors because you kind of weigh all 4 of them together in making this decision. Many times, cities will be in this particular circumstance that we're describing here, where they are adding land to the boundary. When they look around their city, everything's taken up with one priority. They have more potential land to add than they need. So how do they choose amongst all those areas and add a particular area? That's where this analysis comes in. And it's kind of squishy, but it's a very important part of the analysis. A lot of UGB amendments that are appealed, either to LCDC or the courts, it's all about, well, the city, fine, we'll accept they needed some land, but we don't think they picked the right land. So this location issue, locational factors are a big part of that argument. And thus, a lot of the case law is about that argument. How do you properly make the decision of which land to add? Many of the Willamette Valley cities, the only choice they have is really good quality farmland. So they're making these choices, applying these factors about a lot of options for really good farmland, because that's all they can add, that's all that's around them. So then it gets to be even a higher level conversation on that. So finally, the last step, when the city's all done and they've added land to their urban growth boundary, and they have to plan that land and ultimately zone it based on their needs analysis. If they added that land because they had a need for residential land, and in particular they had a need for some percentage of higher density residential land and some percentage of medium density, they've got to provide for that use to happen. It's not like they just add some land and walk away. It's very important that then the planning that takes place be done to make sure it develops that way. This gets to be a pretty critical choice, for example, when cities are adding industrial land to provide for a deficit of need for industrial land. The concern is that you'll hear bandied about in this work group is bait and switch. You add some land because you needed it for industrial, and gee, a couple years later it turns into residential. The idea is if you need that for industrial and it's needed so badly that you're going to take some farmland in, you need to in some way make sure that that's what it develops as. That's this planning step. Recognizing that many cities don't upzone their urbanizable vacant land for years. So it sits in a kind of a holding zone. Many times it's zone DFU as a holding zone, but the plan has to be clear, and this is especially clear for housing, that when an owner decides, okay, plan says I can have housing, that the standards are clear and objective to allow for that housing. And that they don't preclude the use. In other words, they allow that housing. Welcome. So finally, I wanted to mention that the administrative rules that LCDC finally adopted in 2006 for this, and they went through and changed those again a couple of years later. They provide safe harbors. So all the little steps that we just went through where city decides how much is their 20-year need? How do they turn their population forecast into housing need? How do they inventory their land and decide what to do about parcels that are a certain size? How much infill to expect? All kinds of those questions we tried to answer with something in this Division 24 that I handed out. We've got some handouts we'll get you. How do they, is there a quick and dirty step that we can provide by rule and say, if you follow this step and do this, you will be home free, free space. If you're all done, it's clear, and it will be, the theory is harder to appeal what you did because you followed a safe harbor. So there's a whole series of those there. And so this transitions us into the new UGB process. The new statute provides a process that looks a lot like the one I just described to you, which is based on the Goal 14 as it was written in 74. But it's a simplified process. We hope that it becomes the standard process. In fact, that's the term we're using to describe it. And the old, we're talking about traditional process, is still around. It's going to be around. Many cities will opt not to use the new process that we're designing in this work group. The expectation is that we will do everything we can to try to get a large number of cities to use it, but every city has the option of staying in the traditional process, so it's going to remain in place as it is now. Except these priority statutes in 298 were altered. I mentioned earlier one of those alterations was that now urban reserve is lumped in with exceptions and non-resource land. But there are some other key alterations to that priorities process that are important and that we'll be talking about in the work group. And finally, as you've heard at our last meeting, it's not going to be effective until January 1, 2016. So we've got these new priority statutes that will kick in ultimately, and they will apply not just to the new process, but also to anybody who opts to use the traditional process. The hope is that they are easier to use than the ones that are in law and that have been, as I mentioned earlier, a subject of a lot of litigation, that these will work better. I guess time will tell. So that's my presentation on the overview of the process today. What we want to give you next is some background on 2254. Why did we create this bill? And how did that go? And Carrie's going to come up and help walk us through that.
Well, we probably, even though we're running slightly later than what we had hoped, we probably have a minute, like we could take about
Certainly.
3 to 5 minutes for a couple of questions if they're burning ones that people have. If not, we can get right into it.
Any questions on, I know I went through a lot of material for some of you that haven't been through this before.
So part of this is in statute, part of it is due by admin rule. The statutory piece means that the legislature is monkeying around with probably your best of intentions. How complicated does this get?
It gets extremely complicated, and some of these big cases on UGBs have been all about how to blend in requirements from the goal, which is a rule, and the rules with statutes which really take precedent. And we went through a long period of time when the only, we would make assumptions that, well, that statute applies, but what about the factors in the goal that say you pick your land using these 7 factors or 5 factors that are now down to 4 in what I showed you, or the statutes? How do those two work together? Those are the kinds of things where the courts have had to step in and answer that. It is very complicated. The new process that we just adopted, I think goes a long way towards expecting that most of this will be in the rules rather than the statutes, with the exception of the the priorities, which are still going to reside in the statute, but even there, 2254 tasks LCDC with doing rules on those priorities that weren't overtly required to be put into rules before. So the general principle is to try to get more and more stuff out of the statute and have it in the rules, but for the traditional process, we've got to blend, and it's hard.
And if I could add to that, you know better than most that the legislature is jealous of its power to write the deal. It's hard to change the statute, whereas administrative rules, it's much easier to change. But a couple other factors that play into LCDC and DSLB's ability to do all this stuff. One is we've spent 30 years fighting over rural lands and developing rural lands when all of us involved in the program want to do urban lands. So it's very hard to focus on urban lands. And this is really a big sort of a big scheme effort. We tried a couple things, like the big look, where we were going to rethink the whole program, and it was a waste of time. That's one problem in getting to this, which is why this is so important. Another is that the legislature often, every session, gives new assignments to the LCD, and you have to do those. You can't not do those. So that eats up a bunch of time. So this is a big deal.
And I didn't even go into it, but there's a set of statutes for large cities, that's 296, that has some other features that sort of take over ground that had been previously part of the goals and part of the rules. And that has to do with things like the efficiency measures that we mentioned briefly. And cities have to do, so they have some requirements if there are large cities in metro that are there as well. And over cities are reading back and forth between statutes and the goals and saying, which one do I do first, which one takes precedent? And some of this exercise is to hopefully get some more clarity in that.
I want to add one other note. That is, Bob talked about safe harbors. The department and the commission think safe harbors are safe. Some cities think that safe harbors are a trick, intended to make them do it that way. So there's a fair amount of distrust that goes on. Another fascinating dynamic about this whole thing is that everybody in it complains bitterly about it and demands change. And then when you start trying to do the change, they all go, no, I'm too busy, or really, I understand this and nobody else does, so don't do it.
Oh, sorry, I apologize for being late. Did you discuss urban reserves? If so, then I could...
No, we didn't
No,
go into those.
we did not discuss urban reserves.
How does that play into this? I mean, I guess maybe big picture wise.
Yeah, in a nutshell, the idea of urban reserves when they were first established as a concept was that cities can look out longer than 20 years. Where should the UGB go next? Or what about a city that, they want to put in a sewer trunk line and it's going to serve 50 years. Well, they want to have some reasonable assurance that beyond the 20-year boundary, that it's going to go to that basin that's to the south rather than up north. At the long term, if the process is going to lead the UGB up there, maybe they won't put in that 50-year sewer line. And so the idea of the urban reserves with that as a starting point was, let's identify lands in advance that will be first into a UGB with a 50-year look. And 50 years itself is sort of an exaggeration. It's from 10 years, at least 10 years, but not more than 30 years beyond the current UGB.
But it's short of actually expand, I mean... does it
That
make it
land
easier?
stays as farmland.
Yeah, does it make it easier
It makes
though
it
to-
easier in this,
okay.
the part in which it makes it easier is the last few steps of the process, which I think you'd come in for, which is to say, well, what's the priority of lands to be
Sure.
included and what's the study area? You still have to make the same demonstration of a showing of need and of a deficit inside of your urban growth boundary. But the where do I go to grow
Factors.
question has been, you are now in the first priority for lands to be included inside of UGB.
And by the way, that urban reserve process happened before the priority statutes. So indeed, many cities became very interested in reserves because the priority statutes say the first priority is urban reserve, and cities go, oh, light goes on. If I establish an urban reserve, then all the rest of those priority statutes don't bother me, even if it's farmland. I can go to that area first under state law, under the priorities. And so it actually lured a lot of cities into the process. that maybe wouldn't have been interested in reserves. We still don't have many cities interested in urban reserves. But those that have gone through that process realize quickly that the process to establish a 50-year urban reserve involves a lot of the same steps we just went through, but with a 50-year look. And not near as much detail about exactly what is that land going to be. Is it going to be exactly for this purpose or that? So it's a little more mushy. But otherwise, it's a similar process to establish a longer-term boundary.
For instance, like industrial versus residential or something, and I'm just thinking of that in those terms.
Right, and so if a reserve was established and the intent was to provide for industrial land, the plan should be clear that that's what is intended for that land. But none of that, when you're done with an urban reserve, none of that land is in your UGB. It's just earmarked for when you are ready to expand your UGB. Now it's first priority. And there's some problems with the way that's worked, but because it's never been clear, well, what if you have a big reserve? What's the first land in the reserve to come in?
Well, I was going to say, well, what if you decide to expand the UGB and you know, priorities change, and so the land you want to expand it to may have changed. For instance, maybe another city's growing kind of in your direction, so you're thinking, actually, maybe we need to like grow towards it rather than away from it. I mean, in that UGB process, you could change that, or would you actually have to go through two separate processes to change the UGB, or the...
If you had already established a reserve, an urban reserve, and you, at the time of UGB amendment, decided that you didn't want to go into it, that would be difficult, and you would probably have to do a two-step. Most cities, I guess I haven't seen that happen.
Yeah, it hasn't happened. I mean, theoretically, you're in a different priority, and you'd have to demonstrate that there are reasons why, basically, that land doesn't work. I think practically speaking, it'd be pretty hard, and most cities would probably go through a reserves process. It's a good question, I think in part because an area of southern Oregon in Jackson County just recently went through a long-term regional problem-solving effort to designate urban reserves. And one of their questions around this new process was, how do these pieces relate, and is that work still good? The answer is yes. So there are definitely areas where this new process works. I'm going to go ahead and kick into it because I want to try to give us at least 10 minutes in between time, and because that's probably about as long as my voice will actually last before I start coughing. So Bob, if you'll stay here in case I run out of capacity, that would be nice. Just at the very outset, one thing I will say is that this process is really designed for cities that are growing. And I think Bob probably said that in the beginning. We certainly said that in our first overview, but it's really designed for growing cities. So cities that we think could be filling up their UGBs. And secondly, it does not cover metro. So none of the 24 cities within metro's boundary are covered by this new process. That was intentional, not as any sort of demerit to metro in any way, but that they have just gone through this whole urban and rural reserves planning process, which they think will resolve some of their UGB planning efforts and problems. And we wanted to let that play out before they decided whether or not this was something they might want to opt into. I think, as you all know, that decision is at the Court of Appeals and has not yet been finally decided. So just two things to remember: mostly applies to growing cities and does not apply to cities within the metro area. So I think there are a couple. I just want to sort of walk you through the background of how did we arrive here, and I think Bob said this in his presentation as well. The effort in 2254 is really an honest streamlining effort. We're not trying to get at different outcomes. We're not so much trying to change different priorities. We think we have been growing fairly efficiently as a state. We've been doing better than our Western counterparts. We sort of want to hold ourselves to those same standards as to outcomes on the ground, but we think that we can get there in a more meaningful way for citizen participation and local government work. We think we can do it in a way that is faster, more clear, and easier to predict outcomes, and ideally, and a key component is in a less costly manner. So you will see throughout the statute, simple and simplified. We really are trying to learn from the work that we've done around urban growth planning for the last 40 years and streamline it into a more efficient process for communities. So if you look at Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and California, you see that Idaho has actually become less dense over time, and Oregon is performing fairly well vis-a-vis our land utilization and population growth. It's the same side we really look at, efficiency in cities as a matter of public resources and the public infrastructure work that we do, also capacity to have more multimodal transport or transit services in some. And here again, I think that you see, most cities in Oregon, as we look through them, are becoming more compact than in neighboring states and are becoming more compact as they grow. And I don't think that's a trend that anybody would be particularly surprised about. This just sort of looks at, we said we weren't doing things in the metro area, but you'll find as we go through this that metro is one of the more data-rich areas, and so we will sometimes, where appropriate, draw from metro to sort of increase our understanding. And so if you look at over time as we've made, both as population has grown, I think we certainly see nationally and internationally an increase in urbanization just as a matter of changing demographics worldwide. But even comparing, this northern part of Oregon with Washington, we have less exurban development in the period of 2000 to 2010 than we did in 1990 to 2000. That's partially a function of some significant changes in law protecting high-value farmlands in the Willamette Valley, but also I think a function of the demographic shift. But you can see still a considerable amount, for comparing north of Vancouver in the Washington area. Again, these are just some sort of metrics by which we have measured the outcome of the success of Oregon's land use planning program. It was definitely intended to protect agricultural and forest lands for resource uses, and we still have a large number of those lands zoned in that manner. Our conversion rates are increasingly less, and we don't have a great deal of conversion of land and resource use to low-density residential or urban uses. Where that's occurred, it's been more sort of the non-industrial or smaller lot development. This looks at a change in land use in Oregon. I can actually send to people the PowerPoints where the colors will become a little bit more illuminated because I can't see the differentiation very much here, but you will see sort of more in the metro area, a few blue parts creeping through, which is actually a decrease in development. The red indicates increases in development, and the green is a change to agriculture. And again, this is just sort of looking at where our population growth or development is occurring in Oregon. So our take home, and really what continued to be sort of guiding principles for this work, is that we have been successful in absorbing population growth using less land. We've been more efficient than our neighboring states. And we think there's at least one public good that comes from that on the inside, which is a decrease in public facility and transportation costs over time. We also have the ancillary benefit, as we grow more efficiently, of conserving farm and forest lands for those agricultural and forest product industries. And when I say ancillary, that is a goal in and of itself as well under Oregon's land use planning programs, but it provides those double-edged benefits. So again, this is sort of the background, summary of some of the background research that led to the development of this process with the design team, really focusing on, we hope to see similar outcomes. Not that there couldn't be some improvements, and we'll certainly want to work on those, but we think our outcomes have generally been good. We don't think our path to getting there has been that great, and that's really what we're seeking to focus on. So what do we want out of improving our pathway? We want to see the continued improvement in urban efficiency. We want well-functioning communities that are desirable places to live and work. That is certainly an outcome that we cannot not fulfill. We do hope to make it easier to carry out planned development within existing urban areas. And by that, I would say there's more of a focus in this process as we design the rules at looking at what areas can be serviced, what is impracticable to be served, what is serviceable, and in a horizon where a city really looks at a 7-year perspective on, do we have lands that are serviceable to meet our needs for that. So we think that that will make it easier to carry out planned development within existing urban areas. Certainly, we need and want to reduce the time and expense of UGB amendments. We want cities to have a better sense, communities to have a better sense of what the outcomes will be as they enter an urban growth boundary process. First, as a matter of sort of need and resources, I think, we focused on the planning areas that are growing the most rapidly. So I say that's why this is really one that's designed to, this new pathway should be designed to serve the needs of growing communities. Those cities that are stagnant or decreasing in population and facing real challenges, they need attention too, but they're not going to be served, that attention is not going to be given through this process. And then we need to continue to conserve important farm and forest lands. So our 4 main concepts, population forecasting, that's what we refer to when we resort into bill speak as 2253, but all population forecasting will now be done by Portland State's Center for Population Research, and communities will be given a 10 and 30 year, is that right?
They'll be given forecasts that go all the way out to 50 years, and there'll be increments. So the city should be able to figure out if they want to know what their 27-year forecast is, they should be able to determine that from the PSU forecast.
Population only.
Population only. At employment, this process allows for the Office of Economic Analysis, is that, do I have the acronym correct? OEA. They do employment forecasting for the state, and as far as employment planning goes, cities are given the option of either extrapolating from their population forecast or from OEA's forecast for determining the amount of employment growth that they expect to see.
And by the way, OEA's forecast is sort of done regionally. Sometimes it's just for a county, sometimes it's for 3 or 4 counties. And so there's a little bit of a connection we're probably going to have to do in this rulemaking to how do you turn that into something that a city can use for an employment land forecast that's a certain time period.
John?
Karen, can you tell people why the population forecast is important, how it plays out, and whether someone can project a higher?
Yeah, no, so this process, you have to use the forecast that is given by Portland State. That had been an area of some litigation, not considerable litigation, but some litigation.
Fighting and UGB appeals.
Lots of fighting, particularly at the local level. And so this idea, can we be aspirational? Can we assume we're going to see more growth? This says, you know, the part of the trade-off, I think, in the streamline is to say you're going to come within this sort of bandwidth of more reasonably expected. And if you want to deviate from that, I guess we're calling it the traditional bow tie approach is still available for you to do that urban growth, planning and possible UGB amendment.
And we're going to have our own work group on just the forecasting. It's just starting up now at PSU, and then we'll follow on with ours. And I didn't go into it in my presentation at all, but this whole notion of forecasts that up till now have been done by each county, except some counties have been shirking their responsibility. I would write that in an email, but you'll find several counties that haven't even done recently a forecast. So if the city wants to do a UGB amendment, they don't have an official forecast because it's so old from the county. So that's some of those kinks in the system have been corrected, and we're going to have to do a little bit of work as PSU takes over this function, which we intend to do later this year, or start of next year.
Is it usually the population analysis that actually drives the expansion, or could it, I'm just thinking of, is kind of the chicken or the egg issue, where is it industry that drives population, or is it population that drives industry? Does that make sense? So
yeah, so we don't have to determine that chicken or the egg. I think they're different.
PSU's going to have to make that choice.
Well,
in their forecasting.
So when they do the forecasting, they will be looking at things like, well, what has been the city's success in terms of attracting industry? What have been their employment growth, before? What are the demographics of that community? What sort of assets do they have? Maybe, a community has, great resources in terms of power generation or something. So I think that, those are the kinds of considerations that Portland State will look at in terms of forecasting population growth. But Portland State will be forecasting population growth,
Okay.
irrespective of what the genesis of that population growth is.
Okay, and the potential for economic boom, I guess, or industrial expansion, or just jobs in particular in a region would probably be an input into the model that Portland State. or
They
Portland-
will be, as they do their forecasting, they will be interviewing the community and using that as an input. I have heard demographers say that there is some ability to alter what happens to your community that way, but that the long-term trend of population growth is decided to a large extent by, of course, birth, deaths, and immigration, with some consideration of other things such as you're talking about. But that fight is going to move kind of from the counties over to the Population Research Center at Portland State, and they'll have their process.
I'm going to try to whip through this in about 3 more minutes, but I think actually the principles of what you got from Bob in terms of how UGB works, if you just keep in your mind here that we are trying to do a simpler, faster, more predictable process in the rulemaking, you'll find yourself fairly well oriented. So I already said that. Big piece for a lot of people who are worried about how we make this better, faster, and more predictable. The population forecasting that will be done by Portland State is not a land use decision, so it's not appealable. We check that box, and people do actually get that safe harbor that's not a trick or a trap, but is really truly something that they can use and rely upon. We started off really recognizing a need to distinguish between smaller and larger cities. The research that we've done, information we have suggests those cities behave in different ways in terms of how they redevelop, how they grow, and that we should be considering those differences. And so this bill proposes a different, probably set of factors or criteria for smaller cities versus larger cities. Small cities are cities that are less than 10,000. Large cities are cities 10,000 or greater. And so we will be looking at these things, and something actually we're going to talk about today is also on a regional basis. As we look at development and characteristics of development, we have denser development happening in the Willamette Valley than we do in Eastern Oregon. And so our system will reflect those regional differences. In fact, that'll be a big discussion in our main group today. Another, I would say, characteristic of this new process is to, in terms of diminishing appeals and making it more predictable, is to try to come up with ranges. And within that range, planning community will not have to make findings that they have satisfied it. So if you are within this range, perhaps for, trying to think of examples here, for expected population growth or the housing needs that you'll have from that, you won't have to write particularized findings about why that characteristic is true. So we think that will sort of narrow the focus of issues that can be a basis for argument in cities. I would say, at least in the structure of how the bill is written, there really are very similar methods for the smaller and larger cities. But the ways in which the level of information that may need to be provided, the level of detail, analysis, and perhaps also the expectations, I think definitely in terms of land use efficiency or ability to do public infrastructure, water and sewer planning, etc., is higher for the larger cities than they are for the smaller cities. This essentially runs through these bullets much of what Bob did. Our hope is this becomes the standard method, and the current traditional UGB method will remain as an option. The amount of land that's needed will be based on the population forecast. This is on the residential side. On the employment side, a community will have the choice between the economic forecasting or extrapolating from population growth. We will develop standard ranges for land need. If you say you're growing by X, given your region and your community characteristics, this is what we would expect. If you're between that high and that low, you're sort of home free. And a yield of lands that those from sort of gross to net and based on population conversion will be provided. We are seeking a goal and an outcome of this is to continue to increase urban efficiency. So that one of the measurements or performance measures is that the land area in the UGB may increase only at a rate lower than population growth. You do see scattered throughout the bill references to subject to market, changing market conditions. So this is not willy-nilly Eugene-style planning. No, I'm joking. Or metro area of trying to make everybody more dense, but it is really reflective of market conditions in the communities. A difficult process in urban growth boundary expansions has been this buildable lands inventory. How do you do it? What is required to be shown? What does it mean by vacant or partially vacant? Those are all issues that we will be grappling with in this rulemaking process so that we come up, we're not going to lose a buildable land inventory requirement. We need to know what exists currently before you can do the gap analysis of what's the difference, the delta between what you need and what you have. But we really do need to simplify that process so that communities have more clear direction on how to complete it. Quite frankly, citizen members can participate in a more meaningful and understandable way. The last part is sort of too esoteric. Method includes conditions rather than goal findings. The base requirement here is that we're not going to be requiring separate goal findings. If you make it through this process with a yes, our rulemaking needs to essentially deem those decisions compliant with our goals. I think this is more detailed than what we have time to get into. I will share this PowerPoint with everybody, and I'm open to asking any questions. But at this point, I think absorption rate is going to be small in our remaining minutes before we have the next one. But the series of slides go through essentially what are the different variations between the small and the large cities to try to get a little bit more detail on there. And if people want, we'd be happy to do another one of these sessions before our next meeting. If that's useful.
One of the points of your previous slide talked about the land can't increase in the urban growth boundary any faster than the population is increasing. Is that a simple percentage calculation? Population is going up by 5%, when the land can increase by 5%, or is it more complicated than that?
So I suspect that the baseline of the can't is the 1-to-1 ratio essentially that you suggested. But what we are expecting to see is that communities will become more dense over time, and that the efficiency factors that we will be having as part of this process would indeed yield that outcome. That will be really does it get much more complex than that will be a topic that we will be addressing in the course of rulemaking. How much more should we be trying to seek in other areas? What would be a reasonable expectation that we would be seeing as communities grow, and depending upon what region of the state they're in, how would those rates be increasing?
It's also important that a lot of these are requirements for the process that we're creating this rulemaking. They're not intended to be applied to each and every UGB. So the efficiency, we're supposed to design the process so that cities will be more efficient, and so that they will, that population will increase, or the land will become more efficient compared to population. But not necessarily is the intent that every time a UGB amendment happens, we will look at that. In other words, it's a requirement for LCDC to design a process to do that, rather than intended to be applied at each and every UGB amendment. So that's going to be hard.
So, I mean, put differently, we would be looking at an aggregate of all UGB expansions and evaluating whether or not, as a whole, the state of Oregon is becoming more efficient in its utilization of urban lands. It may be that for a particular city, their urban growth may have, maybe they were, highly efficient, or they need to take in land for a low-density use, whether it's parks or whatnot, that would actually make them look as though they had become less efficient over time. We wouldn't be, that city would have the flexibility to be able to make that kind of needed expansion. They wouldn't be bound by this rule itself.
That's one of the key points of the regions, is that, a lot of the requirements are, you look at, compare it with other cities in the region to look at an average, and if you're, obviously it's very different for a city perhaps in eastern Oregon versus the Willamette Valley, so that's why the key issue of deciding what the regions are.
Another way to look at this, and this is political and gross, but I think it would help you figure out where people are going. That there are like 4 different cities which want a simpler, cheaper method to expand. And after the Court of Appeals decision of the wind bill, they don't see it. Second is development interest. They want certainty. And they want less process and less litigation, because you don't have certainty with process and litigation. Farmland protection people, they don't want expansion. They want to limit expansions. And then citizens who would like to be involved in the policy, and the whole process has gotten so complicated that you have to have a lawyer to get involved. So this is grossly meant to sort of make some assumptions that if we do this, we will get more efficient and expand less. And there's a trade-off in terms of certainty.
Yeah, with more predictability. So, thank you all. We will see you downstairs.
No, it's right next door.
No, right next door, sorry.